Hey there, I'm Chris Oliver. I do GoRails screencast, Jumpstart Pro, and Hatchbox, and several other Ruby on Rails open source projects. And in this talk, I'm going to be talking about how to build real-time applications with Hotwire and ActionMailbox. So we're going to be building a customer support app with Rails where you can send inbound emails and reply, and all of that's going to happen in real time. So it's pretty cool. So first things first is Hotwire. This came out around Christmas time, and this is HTML over the wire. The new version of Turbo Links has evolved into Hotwire. So Turbo Links used to just intercept links on the page, and that was fine and did a good job, but when it came to handling forms and other interactions, it just wasn't quite there. So we were left on our own to handle that, and that's where Hotwire comes in. We've got Stimulus.js, but Hotwire is now being powered by Turbo.js, which is just like Turbo Links, where it will intercept all of the links, but it will also intercept your forms and submit those, and you can publish changes from the backend at any time to update the page as well. So Hotwire is really, really powerful. Now, the other thing that we're going to be using in this talk is ActionMailbox, which is a feature of Rails that's really underappreciated. It allows you to process inbound emails to your application. So if you've ever used Basecamp or GitHub and replied by email, that is what ActionMailbox allows you to do in Rails. And it's a built-in feature of Rails and fully supported, so it is super good to have that as a built-in feature. So what happens is you send an email. It will get processed by whatever email provider you use, like SendGrid, Postmark, there's a bunch of other ones, and they will receive the email with SMTP, and they will convert that over to a webhook. They'll make a post request to your Rails app, which will be received by ActionMailbox. So the process looks a little bit like this. Now, we are going to be storing our text from those emails and processing those emails and saving them in action text. Now, the benefit of this is that we can store images and other attachments with action text in our Rails app. So here you can see uploading an image and having rich text like bold and strikeout and italics, and all of that stuff will just be stored as HTML in your database, and you will be able to render that back out along with some rich text attachments. Like this image here is actually a attachment in your action text editor. So that gets rendered dynamically, and you can use this like my last RailsConf talk on embedding YouTube videos and user mentions and all of that, where you can reference other records in your database. And that's what it's doing exactly for this image right here. So ActionMailbox can be used for a multitude of things. One of those, like I mentioned earlier, was reply by email. So you'll see reply to this email directly, view it on GitHub, or unsubscribe. So if you reply to this email, GitHub's going to read it and then take all of the content out of there and use it as a comment in the issue or a pull request or wherever the notification was from. Another thing that you could use inbound emails for, or ActionMailbox, is building something like Hey World. Hey World is a blog platform, more or less, where you just write an email and it gets published as a blog post. So you just write to world@hey.com, and as long as you're a Hey customer, it will convert it into a blog post for your blog. So it's pretty cool and a great use of ActionMailbox. Another thing that you can use, which my friend Janky's posted on Twitter the other day, was you can actually set up an extra header in your emails for list unsubscribe. And that is, as you can see here, a thing that GitHub uses to put an unsubscribe link. And that can be two things. It can be a URL to unsubscribe, or it could be a mail to, so the user could write an email and basically send an unsubscribe email to get off the notifications. So this is another really cool option for unsubscribing that you can use with ActionMailbox. So our example is going to be building a customer support application. We're going to be able to create conversations with our customers. They'll be able to reply either in the app, or we can reply in the app, and then we can both reply via email So if we're not on our phone or logged into the app, we can just reply via email wherever we're at. So in order to build an app like this, we're going to need a few models. And this is just kind of the very bare bones of what we'll need. We'll need conversations with people. They're going to have many messages, so we'll call those like posts, or we could call them messages, doesn't really matter. And then we're going to have the main user we want to contact. So when we create a conversation, we'll want to contact someone. So we'll have a belongs to on the conversation to contact that user. Now, we need to separate out who is on our team as employees versus our customers. So we'll have the user model where our employees are logged in at be for employees, but we'll have a contact model that has the same attributes like name and email, and those will represent our customers or any other contacts that we might be talking to in our app. Then our post model is going to belong to an author, which I've just marked as polymorphic because we can either be referencing a user or a contact. You could set this up as single table inheritance or many other options here, but that'll work for us. We want to have a rich text body so that we can have an action text field so we can store the HTML for whatever the user wrote, and a message ID. And the message ID is going to keep track of the email's ID so we can keep track of whether or not the email was sent in and already processed, or if we're sending an email out, once that's done, we can store the ID and keep a reference to that. So we can have an email thread chain, and all of these messages will show up in the same thread over email. So let's talk about streaming our application with Hotwire. Now, you can go through and create scaffolds for all those models, or use Devise to set up your user model. But if we scaffold the conversation with those fields, we can go into that view, and I'm using the Rails 7 scaffold, which should have turbo by default, which is exciting. I can't wait for that to ship. But we can start taking advantage of the turbo functionality from Hotwire. So on line 1 here, we have turbo stream from conversation. So that is a method that will add a turbo stream tag to the page, and it will reference the conversation. JavaScript will pick that up and issue an action cable follow. So it will start streaming from that conversation over your action cable WebSockets. And then any changes we make on the back end will be published over that and then applied to the page, which is really cool. So when we navigate to a different conversation, it will close this stream and open up another one for the other conversation, so you don't accidentally get those messages on the wrong page. So that would be bad, and that's kind of taken care of for us automatically with this. The other thing that I want to mention here is on line 12. I've added a div around all of the posts in this conversation with an ID of posts. And that ID is going to allow us to take on the back end any new post or any existing post that we might update or delete. We can then issue updates to the browser. So when we create a new post for this conversation, we can actually insert one automatically into that div, which is going to be pretty cool. So to do that, our post model has a broadcast to conversation. So it's going to look at that association on line 2 for our belongs to conversation. It's going to load that up, and then it's going to say, hey, go broadcast this new post or any updates or deletes to the conversation channel. And it already knows that if you're going to create a new post, you want to append it. If you edit one, we'll replace it with the latest version. And if you delete it, we want to delete it off the page. And all that JavaScript is actually wired up with Turbo.js, so we don't have to write any JavaScript to get that to work, which is really cool. So behind the scenes, Hotwire broadcasts are defined like so. You have a broadcast to method. It takes the stream, which was our conversation, and then it says it inserts by append by default. So maybe you want to prepend the new messages at the top or something like that, maybe like Twitter does. And then the target is the broadcast target default. So it's going to look for the post model. That's what you broadcast. And then it's going to say, okay, you're the post model, so let's take the plural name and let's look for that ID on the page. And you can customize all this to do whatever you need. But the defaults for broadcast 2 are to do an after create commit for the append, the after update commit for the updates or the replacement on the page of the post, and after destroy commit, which will delete it off of the page and remove it when it's been deleted in the database. So creating posts with Hotwire, we'll have our scaffold. So we'll have that, conversation view, and we'll have a form at the bottom that is for a new post for that conversation. So inside the create action for the post controller, when one is successful, you'll see here on line 29 and 30 that we can actually have a custom response for this. So we create the post and save it in the database, but instead of refreshing the page, we can actually just replace the form and clear it out and just render a new form. And that post save on line 28 will trigger the callback to append that new post to the page automatically for us. So we don't have to do that in our controller. And the TurboStream responses are actually kind of like a level on top of HTML, which is interesting. So if you leave the TurboStream format out, it's just going to ignore it and use the HTML format by default. And we've also overridden the TurboStream format on line 34 and 35, where we're saying, hey, your post had validation errors, so why don't we go replace the form on the page and just the form? You don't need to refresh the page or anything. We'll just replace the form with the errors and include those and just let you know, hey, you forgot to type a message before you hit send or something like that. So very simple, but we can use the TurboStream responses in our controllers, which is nice. These will only happen to the current user, whoever made the request. But if we do a broadcast in the model, that will apply to everyone who's listening to that channel. So we kind of have two different ways of responding with TurboStream events like so. And those TurboStream events look like this. So when we call TurboStream, like we did on this last page, TurboStream.replace form, what that generates is this, a little bit of HTML. And this gets inserted onto the page, and the Turbo.js JavaScript will watch for that and then run this action. So the HTML here is a little unique. We have a TurboStream custom HTML element. We have an action with the name replace and a target of form. So we have an ID on our page around the form, or on the form itself probably, called form. So pretty straightforward. And basically this says, hey, when you see this, replace the form on the page with that ID with the one inside of this template. So you'll see there's a template tag and then a form with the post body and the commit message, or in the button and everything like that, all wrapped in this TurboStream template. So that's all the TurboStream stuff is generating server side. A little bit of HTML, sends it over to the client, which inserts it into the page, and the JavaScript takes it from there and runs these actions and applies them to the page. So what that looks like is we can create a post. It replaces the form with errors. If we type in this time, we'll create a post. The form will get replaced and cleared out with a fresh version, and our message will automatically appear under messages because that has been broadcasted through the WebSocket for the conversation. So this is super duper simple on how that works, but it allows us to interact with our application in real time. So, someone else could reply, that's going to pop up immediately. We can have these browsers side by side, and they're going to show the updates in real time, which is great. So let's talk about working on inbound emails through this. So we've got the basics of a conversation working. So we can create our conversation, set up a subject and posts, and that's good, but it doesn't take us where we need to go. We need to send out emails. We need to receive emails instead. So let's talk about creating posts with ActionMailbox. But to do that, we need to talk about the anatomy of an email. Now, if you're like me, you probably haven't actually looked into the details of what an email actually looks like behind the scenes very much. And there's a lot to it, but it's actually pretty straightforward. So let's take this email, for example. I wrote it to myself. Wonderful. It has some text, an emoji, an image inline. That's an important piece. And then it has my name and my website. Pretty straightforward, simple email. But this does have HTML because you can see that link is linked. We could add, bold and other things in there, and that would all be done with HTML. But email is pretty limited. Email has an accepted amount of things you can do. Like you can't put styles unless they're inline, no JavaScript, and there's things to protect you against phishing emails and stuff that might do something malicious, like try and insert something bad that they want you to click on. But let's look at the raw version of this email. I've downloaded it from Gmail, and it looks like this. So here we have something that looks awfully like an HTTP request, which is super cool. So we have a date, we have a message ID, which is a unique identifier for every individual email. We have a subject line, we have a from and a to, which could be multiple people. And you'll notice that the from and the to are a little bit different, right? So the from has my name and then my email in a greater than, less than setup, and then to doesn't have that. So really, that's something we're going to have to work with later on. We're going to need to pull out that display name from the email address if it exists, and maybe it doesn't. So we'll have to deal with that as we go. But as we go on further, we start to see this content type boundary stuff, and then on line 9, a hyphen and a boundary, and some more of that, and it's kind of interesting. We see a text plain content type and what looks like a text version of our email, and that's what it is. But if we keep going, there's a content type HTML that we'll see later on. So underneath the text plain, we see text HTML, and this is the HTML version that Gmail was displaying for us. And it's got some kind of strange HTML in there with some equals and some characters and stuff, and this equals 30D or 3D around our stuff, and it looks kind of strange, but it's generally HTML. So that is our HTML part. But what's interesting after that is that we get the logo included in the email. So this is actually a base 64 version of that email. So when we upload an attachment to our email, it gets converted to base 64 and just added to our email and appended at the bottom. So if you ever added a file, this email file is going to be big. But the email has a content ID. And if we pay attention to that, we can look at our email here in the HTML section, and we'll see that the image source on at the end of line 27 and the beginning of line 28 has a source equal to CID II underscore KMF BM 5PV0. And if we look at that, that is the content ID of this attachment. So that's how they actually do inline attachments. They actually reference it by this content ID. So that's how we are going to have to process these images. Otherwise, they're going to be broken links. We're actually going to have to save these attachments as files in our Rails app, and then we're going to have to modify the HTML and replace those content IDs in the source with the actual attachment URL. So it's not as straightforward as you might expect to process an email. And here you can see that the text version is just an image with the logo PNG. It says, hey, you can figure out where that file is. It's this file name, and then our image source down below in the HTML. So installing ActionMailbox is pretty straightforward. You run Rails ActionMailbox install, and then that adds a migration for your ActionMailbox inbound email model. Then you'll run your migrations to install that. And then you need to configure an ingress service for ActionMailbox. And this can be SendGrid, it can be Postmark, it can be whatever that is supported. This is basically a controller that listens for those post requests. So when your email gets converted into a webhook, the webhooks controllers that ActionMailbox provides will be set up and then this will tell it which one to use. Pretty straightforward. Now, we need to actually protect that webhook URL, because if someone knew you had a Rails app using ActionMailbox, they could start sending anything they want over. Like, say, a file that's 500 gigs large or something ridiculous. And that would be bad, because then they could take down your service. They could do malicious things with it, with whatever they know about how your service works. So inside your Rails credentials, you want to define an ActionMailbox ingress password. I've got one down on line 11. And then we can also set up our Postmark API token or SendGrid or whatever, so that we can send emails out, because we're going to want to do that. If we're accepting emails in, we're probably sending emails out. So we'll have that in our Rails credentials. Now, I want to point out here that it's important to do your environment credentials, so you can separate these out for your different environments like development, staging, and production, so that each of these can have their separate ones. And you don't have to worry about specifying the environment when you're accessing these. It'll automatically be done for you by Rails. So then we can go on to creating mailboxes, which are ways of sorting those emails and processing them differently. So we have one input into our Rails app, the ActionMailbox controller, which is going to take the email from the webhook and create it in memory, and then hand it off to a mailbox for processing. So the way you do that is you run that command and it creates mailboxes. Now I put these in one file here just to show you. We have our main application mailbox. It's like application record, application controller. It's your main parent for all of your mailboxes. But inside of there, you also define your routing. So you can do a routing for a symbol like all, and it will send everything to that, kind of like your root route in your config routes file. But you can also do regex. Now, instead of putting the regex directly on line number 2 and saying, hey, anything that starts with conversation and has an ID in it, instead of putting that just there, we might want to pull out that ID in the conversation email address, so we know which one we are looking for. So instead, I pulled that into a constant, which we can reference from our application mailbox and have that reusable inside of our reply mailbox later on when we're processing. There's nothing in ActionMailbox that will actually pull out the capture group and give us that ID from the regex. So we need to reference this and just do that ourselves later on. So that's why we would kind of separate that out. So to work with these inbound emails, if you have one in your database, you can actually query that. It's just in a regular old model. ActionMailbox inbound email first. I have one in this example, and we can call .mail on it, and that will convert the attachment from active storage, because it stores the contents of these emails in active storage. You can call .mail on the inbound email to convert it to a mail message object, which is the same thing you're using when you're in Action Mailer sending out emails. You're also using that same mail message object to receive emails and process them. So you can use that to call, say, the from address, and it will give you an array of the email addresses that was from. So here we have testedexample.com as the person who sent that email. Now, the Rails conductor doesn't get enough love. This is something accessible in development at /Rails/conductor. DHH has an old open PR about improving this and making it better, and I really hope that it gets a lot of love in the future because it's really useful. So it's super useful when you're using ActionMailbox because there's two ways of sending test emails to your Rails app. You have a form like this, which kind of resembles your email client, where you say, I want to write an email to with the subject line and a body, and that will create an email and send it to the Rails ActionMailbox stuff and process that. So that's pretty straightforward. But there's another way of doing that where you can take in the raw source of an email and paste it into this box, and it will actually process that as a mail message and save that inbound email. This is a lot more useful because you can have multi-part emails kind of built in here. You can just paste that in, test it out in your browsers or your email client and say, hey, I want to use this actual email. We want to make sure that this link works or this image attachment works or whatever. And it's a lot easier to do this from source instead of that previous form. So that's what this is really useful for. Now, our mailboxes are pretty simple. They have a process method, which is going to be where you begin processing the email. So we have access to the inbound email variable and the mail variable, which is the mail message. And on line 6 here, you can see anytime we get a new conversation, we're going to say subject in the conversation that we're creating. We're just going to make it equal to the mail's subject. And then we can create a new post for this author. Now, I've set up the author method so that we can basically look up, is there a team member in our company that sent this email? We want to look them up in the user table if so. But if it's a customer, we're going to create a contact for them and just create a different record and assign that to our polymorphic contact association there. Then on line 9, we're going to assign the body of the email, which we will talk about in just a second, because that's where we're going to grab either the HTML or the text or whatever from the email and store that in active storage. And that body is an active storage, or an action text, I should say, action text column. So then lastly on line 10, we have the mail's message ID being saved. So we know this post was referencing that email, and we have reference to that later on when we send a reply, and we want our email reply to actually reference this message in your email client. So that's an important piece that we want to keep in order to keep that same organization in our app as well as in our email client. So the body is something that's pretty interesting because it can have multiple parts. It's not just a plain piece of text. It can have multiple copies of the same thing, like we saw. There's a text version, there's an HTML version, and then there's attachments. So we want to check that mail and say, hey, if you're multi-part, do you have an HTML part? If you do, we want to go process that and replace those inline images and things like that. And we can also check if you're multi-part and maybe you don't have an HTML part, but you do have a text part. Then we can grab that and basically take the text version of that and store it in action text. And otherwise, if it's not multi-part, then I guess it's just a plain text email and we can just grab the mail's decoded contents and just save that. Now, this probably needs some tweaking depending on, how emails work on that exception case there with mail.decoded on line 11. I haven't really tested that out yet. Most of my focus was on in the HTML parts. So in order to process those HTML parts, we have to make some adjustments here because we need to assign the attachments to the Rails app. So to do that, I made a method called attachments, which will go through all of the attachments in the email and loop through those one by one and upload them to active storage, save them as blob. We can grab the content of the attachments since they're just a raw string. We can grab them as a string IO object. So it treats it like a file, but it's just a string in memory. We give that the file name and the content type to active storage, and it's able to save that as a blob. And then we're going to keep track of all of these with the blob and the original attachment. So we can go through the HTML and say, hey, we found a reference to this. Let's now replace the attachment ID with the blob attachment instead. So to do that, we can process the HTML like so. We can create a Nokogiri HTML object, which will go and parse all the HTML from the email, creates a document in memory that we can work on and operate on. So we can go through our attachments and then grab, as long as it has a content ID, we can go through the HTML document and query for those. So we're using a CSS selector on line 25 and saying, can you find any images with the source equal to the CID : the attachment content ID? If you do find those, then we want to replace that with an action text attachment. So if you've used action text and you've uploaded an image or you've added some custom attachments, you have a special HTML element called an action text attachment. And that has several fields on it. You have the assigned global ID, and that is an important thing. It is an ID that references any model and any record in your database in Rails, but it's signed, so the server can verify that that was not tampered with. So if you have an attachment and someone's trying to mess with your attachment, that's not going to be valid if they tweak it and mess it up. So this is a signed global ID, so the server is going to verify, yeah, no users didn't mess with anything, so it's safe to reference. And this also keeps track of the content ID and the file name and some other things as well for the action text attachments, and that will get processed when this gets saved. So we're kind of just operating on the emails HTML, tweaking it a little bit, and then at the very end we grab that new document that we have and we can save that in our database. So that is all, and I have an example here where we can say, let's paste in the email that we just used for testing, where we have that image in line. We can just download that from our email editor, and if we paste that and run it, it's going to show up immediately, but look at this image. It's linking to example.org. It's kind of strange. Why would it be doing that? Action text uploaded the file and everything. There was no errors. It was able to render all this text out, and it matches. So what's wrong? It seems a little strange. Well, what is happening is that post was being broadcast from the back end in your background jobs. So you created the record, the callback in the post model, started the background job to broadcast this, and that background job is not part of a request. So it didn't know what URL you're on. It doesn't know you're on localhost 3000, so it defaults to example.org. So to fix this, we need to set a default URL option in our environment for Action Controller, because that is what renders our post partial that gets appended to the page there. So we can set this line, save it, restart our Rails app, and retry it, where we can go and say, okay, let's go paste this in, deliver the inbound email. The image doesn't show up immediately, but if we give it a second, Rails is going to request that. It's going to process the image and do any variants or anything that it might need to do, and it will show up. And that is because the action text or active storage images actually go through Rails URLs. So you could modify and say, hey, we want the 10 pixel tall version or a square version or a large version or whatever. So these requests are kind of separate from just, rendering out the link to the URL. So that takes a second, but it works now and everything is wired up correctly. So now we can talk about replies to our emails. And there's a bunch of ways to do this. I'm doing a very simple version where we will send you, when we send you an email, we're going to send it to, in a way that you will reply to a conversation hyphen the ID number, so we can look that up easily. So when we get into the reply mailbox, this matcher has matched in our routing and said, okay, we'll send that over to the reply mailbox. It'll drop into the process, and we will go and ask for the conversation. So we'll go from line 5, we'll jump down to 14. We'll try and find the conversation by the ID. And line 15 is going to say, okay, let's grab the conversation ID, which will go down to 18. And then we'll go search the recipients again and see, hey, do we find anybody that matches that regex? Which it will, because we already got here. ActionMailbox already used that. So we'll find that recipient, and then we can use the square brackets with the regex and grab the first capture group. And that's what the square brackets at the end of line 19 are doing. So it's grabbing the /d plus out of the regex, which is the number, the ID of our conversation. Then it goes back up to line 15, finds it in our database, and then continues on line 5 to create a new post. So we set up our author, do the same thing as we did before. We look up the user and we, look up a contact if we need to. That should probably say author as author instead of contact. Then body goes through the same process where we grab all the attachments and upload them and save them and set that body. And then we can keep track of that message ID as well. So it's very similar to our conversation mailbox, but uses a little bit of extra stuff to take the email address and parse that. So when we create a post in our app, like we did with the form where we were like, typing a message and then the TurboStream appends it and replaces the form. Once that's successful, we can actually do a reply via email. So we've saved the message in our database and we need to email that out to the conversation, everybody in there. So we're going to create a reply job instead of calling that mailer with a deliver later. And the important piece here is that we want to save that email we send out and grab the message ID so we can save it in our database. If we were to do a deliver later, it's going to send the email, but we're not going to have a way to record that message ID. So we need to do something different, like a background job. So we'll go through this. Basically, we create the reply job and we give it the post that was just created and we say, hey, go email this out to everybody. Now, I based a lot of this off of how GitHub handles their email notifications. And we can see on line 10 here, we go to the conversation mailer, and we pass in some parameters, and we call on line 18, new post, deliver now. Deliver now is going to return that mail message object, and so we assign it on line 10, so we can update the post on line 20 and save that ID, that unique ID, so we can say, okay, this has been sent out, and this is the email. Now, because we're keeping track of all of those message IDs from any inbound emails and any outbound emails, when we send an email, we can do some interesting things. So we can send this email to a noreply@example.com email address. So that's kind of strange because normally you write an email address or an email and it goes directly to some person. Well, in a GitHub thread or something like that, we maybe don't want to do that because it would expose everybody's emails and, that line could get pretty long with all the twos. So what they do is they send it to no reply at, whatever example domain you have. And then you BCC everybody. So no one sees the other email addresses there. But on line 13, we can go through all the recipients, which we've defined on line 27, so we can get all the authors from the conversation. So every person who made a post, we can remove this current post's author, because the person who wrote the message doesn't need an email that they wrote it. They already wrote it. They know they did that. So we remove them and send this email out to everybody else in the conversation. And then on line 12, if we go back up there, we'll see that this is a reply to conversation with the ID in the email address. So we're making dynamic email addresses because when you send an email, it's going to go to the server and it's just going to basically take that, send it to your Rails app. Doesn't care what email address it is. It's just looking at the at whatever domain and handling that. It doesn't care who it's to specifically. So we can make these dynamic email addresses with the ID or some token or anything else you might want in there. And we can use that so that when the user is in their email on their phone and they're like, hey, I'm going to reply by email, it will go to this address and then be received as an inbound email. So we also need to send in the post and the conversation just so that we have those when we are rendering out the email. So you can say, so-and-so replied to this conversation. Do you want to read this? And then the next step is our in reply to and references on lines 16 and 17. So because we have recorded all those message IDs in our database, we can actually say, hey, this person wrote a reply to the previous message. So we can look that up and say, okay, this is an email that replies to that. and then your browser or your Gmail or Hey or whatever email service you're using can see this new email come in and says, oh, it's a reply to this other one that you've already seen. So we're just going to put that in the same thread. And then references does the same thing, but it includes all of the IDs. And so generally they're all going to be in the same thread. So it's just going to know, hey, we're going to include that here as well. So that's how email keeps track of those things with the email headers for in reply to, references, reply to, BCC. There's a ton of stuff. And email can actually get pretty complicated, as you might have realized here as we go through this. So that's going to allow us to send the email in a very nice manner and then keep track of it so we can send other emails in that same organization. Now, next up, we need to actually take a look at that mailer that we've written. It's actually super simple. We don't even need this before action, but it's kind of useful. We can save that instance variable if we only passed in the post. I know in my last slide, we include the conversation as well, so it's not really needed, but you could skip passing in the conversation and assign it as a variable to keep that those arguments simpler. And then you'll notice on lines 7 and 8, we define the headers, in reply to, and references. Those are the parameters that we gave as we sent in. You might be able to deduce that from the post or whatever. But I would prefer my mailers don't have a ton of that logic in here. I like it being in the job, especially when we've got to already, query for the post and save the message ID and everything there. We can just keep our mailer very simple. So you have our to, our BCC, and you could add anything else that you might need in here as well. And your mailer is just going to be like an average old mailer that you would write normally. So, basically now, our final version of this is we can create replies in the app, and then we can also test inbound emails that go to that same conversation, in this case, conversation-2 at example.com, and it will show up and create a contact for our test user, insert it into this conversation, and we're able to reply to that as well. So we can have emails going out, emails coming in, and users using this application directly from the website as well. And it all is working in real time. So that is, how to build a real-time application with Hotwire. It's actually super duper simple. And then the inbound email functionality is really powerful. So if you have any sort of commenting or email, text writing interactions, this is perfect for that. And it is one of those features I think more applications need to use because it really makes interacting with your app way easier. If you get a notification and you don't have to log in to actually work with your app, it is such a good experience. So I really love this. You can use it for unsubscribing. You can use it for replies and all kinds of things, publishing content. The list goes on. It's really, really useful and handy to have. So that is it for my talk. I hope you enjoyed it, and you can find me or the talk code and everything on github.com/exid3. I've got a bunch of Rails repos up there as well that you might also be interested in. And if you want to find out more about me, take a look at gorails.com. That is where I do screencasts every week like this on topics about Rails and other cool new stuff. So that is it. Thank you for attending, and I hope you enjoyed it.